Pod Apostle. Help us build the kingdom. Like, share, and subscribe. Hello and good day from beautiful Bay St. Louis, Mississippi. Our Lady of the Gulf Catholic Church and Radio Maria. Great to have you back here in the 17th week of Ordinary Time in 2025. And this week, we have July the 29th. And July the 29th is an anniversary. It's a big anniversary in the church. A very significant event happened on July the 29th, and I'm just let you be curious about that for just a minute. Praised be Jesus Christ, and always be praised, and Hail Mary. You know, this past weekend, we had a reading from the Old Testament, and in that reading, Abraham was engaged in a kind of conversation with the Lord. The Lord had visited him with two angels, and now Abraham is engaged in this conversation in this kind of mysterious sense of revelation. And the Lord says to Abraham, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin is so grave, that I must go down and see whether or not their actions fully correspond to the cry against them that comes to me. I mean to find out. End of quote. Now, what was going on in Sodom? Well, I think most people know, okay? It's sexual immorality. And the sexual immorality was of a particular kind. Now, it was not, I'm sure, exclusively sodomy, where the word comes from. Sodomy comes from Sodom. But it included that, and probably every other kind of sexual immorality that one can imagine. Now, I heard somebody say a few years ago, and this is kind of one of those things lots of people have said, I would imagine. But when they first said it to me, it struck me a little bit. And it was, if God doesn't do something about our present world, he's going to owe an apology to Sodom and Gomorrah. Because Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed for their sexual immorality, for the sins against human nature and against the dignity of the body, the image and likeness made by God that we get to share in. And so they were sinning against themselves and against God and against their nature. And so God, destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. I don't think, again, that's not necessarily a surprise to those who are listening to me. But as we reflect on the consequences of sin, we need to think a little bit about what it is. Sin is to miss the mark. Again, I've used this illustration a bunch of times, so those of you that are familiar with it, you come right along with me, and if it's new, hear it, because it's a good illustration. You imagine a bullseye, and you're an archer, okay? So you're trying to shoot an arrow at the bullseye. Well, the bullseye is the aim of your life. You are the archer and the arrow. And sin is to miss the bullseye. It's to miss the point of your life, which is union with God, which is virtue, which is holiness. To sin is to miss that for which we were created. And so relationship, you and I were made for relationship, and particularly relationship with God, to love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And to sin is to fall short of that. Now, it is to fail to see and to pursue and to strive after the goal of human life, which is to love and be loved. Ben Franklin said that sin is not hurtful because it is forbidden, rather it is forbidden because it is hurtful. Very common sense approach to understanding sin. A sin is an offense against God, love, truth, reason, and right conscience. Sin destroys. Sin is a sickness of the soul that causes further sickness. God has given us the power and the capacity to do good. To do good, really and truly, we can do good. And to sin is an abuse of that God-given power to do good. I remember one time I was in a marriage prep class, and I'm talking to this young couple, and I talk to them. I oftentimes will give a little talk about, sex outside of marriage is a sin. And I remember one day, somewhat sheepishly, but with enough courage to get it out, the guy says, well, we talked about that. We don't think it's a sin. And I said, who asked you if it was a sin? That you don't get to make up You're not God. You don't get to say what's a sin and what's not a sin. And I was thinking about this, this guy Luigi Maggioni. He shot the United Healthcare CEO in the back. I bet he didn't think that was a sin. What about, Ted Bundy, who went around Florida, raping and killing, co-eds. I bet he didn't think that was a sin. In Scotland a few years ago, there was a guy who was arrested. He claimed to be transgender. He got put into a women's prison and raped the women in the jail. If you can believe that, it's a big to-do over there. And I remember thinking, how ridiculous can we get? But nonetheless, I wonder if he thought lying about that and raping the woman was a sin. It's not up to us. Sin is all of those things that I said it was a moment ago. But because of our fallen nature, sometimes we are blinded to what sin is. And that's why we need the church to hold up clearly and teach what sin is and what sin is not. So what happened in the church on July the 29th, 57 years ago? An encyclical letter was released by Paul VI in 1968 named Humanae Vitae, of human life. And in this encyclical letter, what is an encyclical letter? It literally means a letter that goes in a circle. And back in the olden days, before we had the technologies that we have, it would literally be delivered from one place to the next place through the circuit of the churches. But now it just gets sent out, promulgated, this teaching on this day. And the Humanae Vitae was written in the context of, now let's just back up and give a very brief sketch of what it's about. It's addressing the question of human sexuality and the use of contraception, particularly artificial contraception, and whether or not that was morally prohibited or morally allowed by the teaching of the church. And historically, it had always been prohibited. And in the face of the rapid cultural shifts, the sexual revolution, scientific advancements, contraceptive technologies, worries about population explosion, and the church, under the guidance of John the 23rd, Pope John the 23rd established a commission to study the question about whether or not this was a reformable teaching. And, John the 23rd died, the commission met, and they came to their conclusions, although all they were done was to give recommendations, to give a recommendation. Well, their recommendation was to amend the teaching. I know that people are going to jump all over that. Well, Paul VI took their recommendation, prayed over it in his office as the Pope, and came back and said, no, contraception is immoral. And he wrote this encyclical, Humanae Vitae. And when the world knew, and we have to go back to the 1960s, the Second Vatican Council had just closed, everything was up for grabs, the church was changing in so many different ways, and they were waiting with kind of bated breath for this encyclical to come out and change the church's teaching on the morality of sex and artificial contraception. And lo and behold, he put it out and he said no. And he gave his reasonings, and he wrote the letter, and he upheld. And this is a critically important point. The church, when she teaches authoritatively that something is immoral by its nature, it doesn't change. We don't vote on morality, okay? Now, circumstances change and things change, but if it was a sin yesterday, all those things I talked about a minute ago, it'll be a sin tomorrow, okay? And so how he described the nature of human sexuality, and how we're going to get back to Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was sexual immorality. Okay, that was the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. It happened to include sodomy, but it included lots of other stuff. So I just want to hold up, sexual immorality, which is a scourge that has happened in the world recently. And so he talked about, Paul VI said that marriage is a sacred institution rooted in God's plan. And that shouldn't be a surprise that that's the Christian teaching on marriage. It is a covenant and a contract, but more of a covenant that brings about a new family. And that the marital act, and when I say marital act, in the old days we would say the conjugal act, and kind of maybe easiest to understand, sexual intercourse between a man and a woman. The marital act should be free, that is involved a free commitment, full, the body, the soul united, the spouses in mutual affection, a complete self-giving between a husband and wife. It should be fruitful, that is, open to the transmission of life, reflecting a creative partnership with God, and it should be faithful. And that means exclusive to one lifelong partner. Obviously we understand till death do you part, and if there's a death in the marriage, then the partner is free to remarry. So free, full, fruitful, and faithful. That's what human sex and the bond between a man and a woman should be. So, and merely, again, I mentioned a moment ago that marriage is both a contract and a covenant, but to understand the nature of covenant, of sacrificial, of binding, of supported by God, and that the sexual act inside of marriage has two purposes, and the two purposes are unity. It unites the couple in a particular kind of intimate bond. That the sexual act is not something that either partner can have with anybody else. It's exclusive to that one person in the covenant of holy matrimony, and that it is procreative. That means that it brings new life, and that those two ends cannot be separated. And what separates those two ends? The union that sex brings about and the procreation that sex brings about. By nature, okay, again, we're talking about by nature. And what separates that is artificial contraception, okay, and things like pills and condoms and sterilization, and those things are sinful because they separate the unitive and the procreative act or dimensions of the marital embrace. Okay, and Paul VI, when he talked about the pill and condoms and sterilization and saying these things were sinful, he said they violate natural law. Now, what is natural law? Natural law is that law that is written into our bodies, and it's written into all of nature, okay? And so if you want something to not only survive but thrive, you have to treat it according to its nature, according to natural law. If you want a human child to thrive, you would have that child in the context of one man, one woman in a lifelong, stable, committed relationship. Okay. Now, can a child survive and thrive outside of that? Well, under certain circumstances, but really natural law says that it's going to be much more difficult and much more challenging. I heard an example by a lady named Dr. Janet Smith, who talked about contraception in a talk that was very influential on me in my time in the seminary. And she used the tomato plant as an example. And she said, if you want a tomato plant to thrive, you have to water it, you have to give it sunshine. That's tomato nature. It needs water and sunshine. If you put it in a closet and pour gas on it, you're treating it against its nature, and it is not going to thrive. Well, we have to ask, what is the nature of human relationship? What is the nature of marriage? What is the nature of the sexual bond? And the church says that the nature of the sexual bond and the nature of marriage is that it would be free, that it would be full, that it would be fruitful, that it would be faithful, and exclusive. And if we don't treat marriage and the sexual relationship according to its nature, then we are going to have horrible consequences, such as what? And he actually gave us some consequences in that letter, the encyclical letter. He said, with the rise of contraception, we will have more marital infidelity. We will have the objectification of women, particularly, which I would say pornography and sex trafficking and strip clubs and all of those things are objectification of women, objectification of the human body. Okay, when sex is reduced to not free, full, fruitful, and faithful. And then he talked also about something that I would not have ever thought of, but he talked about that governments would use contraception as a means of abusing their power over their populace. And anybody here ever heard of the one-child policy of China? Of course. So, and then finally he said that if we separate, if it becomes common practice to separate the unitive and the procreative functions of sex, then there's going to be a general moral decline. We are just going to see because we're going to be operating at such a fundamental level against nature, we are going to see human society begin a decline. Now, he was right in these prophecies, because I can go back and point to contraception as a root of many of the social ills that we have. You know, I think that we can see that. Not everybody sees that, but I'm encouraging you to consider that. G.K. Chesterton once said, it is not that the teachings of the church regarding sex have been tried and found wanting. In other words, they've found that they're problematic. Rather, he says, they have not been wanted, and therefore they have not been tried. Okay? Now, one of the things that I have seen in my 20 years as a priest, I have seen like a wholesale rejection of Humanae Vitae. Okay, I've seen that in like not even a consideration. Okay, and now in the last 5 years or so of my priesthood, more and more and more young couples are getting married understanding Humanae Vitae. They're getting married, and again, I know a lot of people aren't getting married in the church. So the couples that I'm seeing wanting to get married in the church are more often likely to want to look into the teaching of the church. Now, not every couple by any means. I know that many of them kind of roll their eyes at me when I start talking about these things. But it is my responsibility to hold up to people that come to me to be married, to talk about this is the nature of marriage. This is the nature of your sexual relationship. It is not just good, it is sacred, okay? And that in order for you to have the free, full, faithful, fruitful marriage, you need to embrace and understand the teachings of the church and understand that marriage is sacrificial. Understand that marriage is difficult. Understand that children are the natural byproduct of your sexual relationship. They are not a symptom that something went wrong with your sexual relationship. They are the fruit of God's design and plan for marriage. Again, kind of back to marriage prep and Sodom and Gomorrah and what the teaching of the church is. I ask people sometimes, or I'll say to them, I know you love your children, and I know you want what's best for your children. But one of the best things that you can give to your children is brothers and sisters. A family, a family that has, some depth to it and breadth to it. That your children recognize that their life is something precious and good. And something about contraception that, as we kind of dive into this a little more deeply, in the history of the United States, contraception was illegal. It was illegal, and it wasn't made illegal by the Catholic Church. It was made illegal by state legislatures. It was made illegal by many Protestants would have supported the understanding that contraception should not be available to people. And if you go back further in history to John Calvin and Martin Luther, they would have taught against contraception. Sigmund Freud, who is no friend of the Catholic Church and was not even a believer. He's Jewish by ethnicity, a non-believer by faith, and he said that it is characteristic and common to all perversions that in them reproduction is put aside as an aim. It is the actual criteria by which we judge whether a sexual act is perverse. If it departs from reproduction and its aim is to pursue the attainment of gratification independently. And so the same thing is happening today. And if God doesn't do something about what's going on here, he's going to owe Sodom and Gomorrah an apology. And I think we're already experiencing it. We don't have to wait for God to smite us. The very nature of the breakdown of the family is undermining our societies. So what about Mahatma Gandhi in 1925 made a prophetic statement? He said, "I urge the advocates of artificial contraception." In 1925, I urge the advocates of artificial contraception to consider the consequences. Any large use is likely to result in the dissolution of the family bond. He was a prophet too. He understood. He saw it. So why would he say such a thing? Well, because contraception had been making inroads particularly into the Western world. And in 1930, for the first time, the Anglicans, the Episcopalians, passed. In 1930, they passed an allowance to use artificial contraception in marriage. So, in the late 1960s, when the promise of the pill was at its height. And what were the promises of the pill? What were the promises of the pill? Vatican II had just finished. So here, I'm going to repeat this. In the late 1960s, when the promise of the pill was at its height, Vatican II had just finished. The sexual revolution was underway. People in the Catholic Church began a campaign to change the teaching of the Church regarding contraception, and they were convinced that the Church would change. And they pointed to all of these reasons. Well, if we have contraception, then we will have fewer children, fewer unwanted children, fewer single mothers. Families would be more stable, healthy marriages, happier families, more satisfying sex, easy, worry-free access to sex would make marriages better and happier. And that was all promised by the advocates of artificial contraception. And then artificial contraception became the law of the land. And sure enough, we had easy and worry-free access to sex. We had fewer children in marriage. We sure did. And then sex outside of marriage increased. Fewer children within marriage made marriages more selfish. Worry-free access to sex made children, young people, teenagers, more likely to engage in sex. It lowered morality across the board. The objectification of women exploded. And, pornography became commonplace. I think probably prostitution increased, and governments began to impose contraception for population control, And so we see these horrible effects. And oh, by the way, things that Paul VI didn't predict but happened anyway. Abortion exploded, okay? Because now you're having all this worry-free access to sex and using contraception. But guess what happens? Contraception sometimes fails, okay? Or you just have an attitude of sex is just, casual. And so, you have a couple drinks at the bar and you meet somebody and you have sex and you're just not even thinking about contraception. It's just one of those things. And lo and behold, somebody gets pregnant. And if that happens enough, so this rise of the pill is happening in the 60s. The attitude towards contraception is changing across the board. And what year did abortion become legalized across the country by Roe versus Wade? What year was that? 1973. As I'm telling you all this, I'm thinking about the fact that, you know, once upon a time, as a 20-something, before I really had my conversion, if you will, as I was eyeing the possibility of even feeling myself being called to the Catholic Church, I had all these questions, not called to the Catholic Church, called to the priesthood. I had all these questions about the teachings of the church and my obedience to the teachings of the church. And, and sometimes people will compliment me on teaching in my homilies. And one of the reasons that I oftentimes find myself teaching in my homilies is because I can reflect on my life and recognize I didn't know. I didn't know some fundamental things about the teachings of the Catholic Church, like contraception, okay? I had believed all those things because the culture was teaching those things. And the church seemed to be almost mute about the very teachings that she had, because what happened was, when the encyclical was released in 1968, unfortunately, many priests and even bishops came out in protest against it and said, we do not support this teaching. So it was really a moment of rupture in the church that coincided with the rupture in the liturgy and rupture in, understanding authority across the board, and the consequences have been horrible. This is a call to conversion. What was the first word of Jesus's public preaching? Okay, repent. Okay, return. Understand. Hear me say to you, the nature of human sexuality is holy and sacred and good and life-giving. Okay, and that we must teach our children and our grandchildren the dignity of their bodies. And as a priest, I have to talk about these things and let the chips fall where they may. I have to be able to look people in the eye and say, this is the teaching of the church. So my brothers and sisters, we celebrate the 57th anniversary of Humanae Vitae. A difficult teaching, a challenging teaching, a divisive teaching, but a teaching that has continued to stand the test of time. Okay, the predictions came to pass that were made in the document, and there is this spark of renewal in the young families that are remaining in the Catholic Church, that want to live a Catholic life, and it's beautiful. It's beautiful to see these big families popping up here and there. So praise be Jesus Christ, always be praised, and Hail Mary.